I'd always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, the kind you see in movies with a happy couple, beautiful decorations, and everyone cheering for love. Standing in my white gown with a bouquet of roses in my hand, I almost had it all. Mark, my soon-to-be husband, looked dashing in his tuxedo, his eyes locking onto mine as I walked down the aisle. But I couldn't help but notice his mother, Nancy, sitting among the guests, her eyes piercing through me like needles. She was dressed impeccably, as always. Her expression was of someone tasting something bitter. As I reached the altar, I heard her whisper just loud enough for me to catch. Could have chosen a more elegant dress, but what can we expect? The words felt like a jab, intended to bring me down a notch during what should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. The ceremony continued smoothly, and Mark and I exchanged vows. The way he looked at me, with so much love and promise, momentarily drowned out the negativity emanating from Nancy. We were pronounced husband and wife, and as we made our way back down the aisle, now as a married couple, Nancy stood up and mockingly shouted, "Don't trip now, dear! The hard part is just beginning." At the reception, as Mark and I danced our first dance, he leaned in and whispered, "You okay? You seem a bit off." "It's your mom," I said, trying to focus on his eyes. "She's really making me uncomfortable." Mark sighed. "Mom's always been like that. She says what's on her mind, filter or no filter. Don't let her get to you." As the evening wore on, Nancy seemed to have made it her mission to critique every aspect of our celebration. From the food, interesting choice, serving chicken, to the music. A bit too loud, don't you think? Her unsolicited opinions were endless. The final straw was when we were about to cut the cake. Nancy swayed over and whispered in my ear, "Make sure you hold a knife correctly, dear. Wouldn't want people to think you're clumsy as well as tasteless." I had to clench the knife handle to stop myself from retorting. Instead, I forced a smile, cut the cake, and focused on the faces of our friends and family, people who genuinely wished us well. But Nancy's words lingered like a dark cloud over the entire evening. Later that night, as Mark and I headed towards the car that would take us to our honeymoon destination, he looked at me and said, "I know my mom can be difficult, but remember, we're in this together now, for better or worse, right?" I nodded, for better or worse. And as we drove off, the cheers of our loved ones fading into the distance, I couldn't help but wonder what worse would look like with Nancy in the picture. Little did I know then just how far she'd go to make that term a living reality for me. The wedding was supposed to be the beginning of a beautiful chapter in our lives, but with Nancy casting her ominous shadow, I knew I'd have to prepare for battles I never saw coming. After the whirlwind of the wedding and honeymoon, Mark and I settled into domestic bliss, or at least as close to bliss as one could get with Nancy lurking in the background like a villain in a spy novel. We moved into the cozy little house I had inherited from my late father. It was a modest dwelling, but it was home, filled with the happy memories of my childhood. I had a stable job at a marketing firm, and Mark was climbing the corporate ladder in his mother's company. Life was ordinary, in a comforting sort of way, until the day I was summoned to a meeting at work. "We're downsizing," my boss announced, avoiding eye contact. "I'm sorry, Lena. We have to let you go." The news felt like a gut punch. "I understand," was all I could muster, gathering my things and walking out of the office with a heavy heart. As I got home, Mark greeted me with a hug. "How was your day?" he asked cheerfully, not yet aware of the storm cloud hanging over my head. "I lost my job today," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark's face turned serious. "Oh, Lena, I'm so sorry." "They're downsizing," I explained, holding back tears. "Now what are we going to do?" Before we could ponder that question further, my phone buzzed. It was Nancy. "Could you both come over for dinner tonight?" "There's something I'd like to discuss," she texted. Skeptical but curious, we accepted her invitation. Mark seemed hopeful. "Maybe it's something good. You never know," he said, his eyes trying to convince himself as much as me. Walking into Nancy's opulent home was like entering a lion's den adorned with chandeliers and high-end furniture. She greeted us with air kisses and guided us into the dining room, where a lavish spread was laid out. "Since Lena is now without a job," Nancy began, not even waiting for us to sit, "I thought perhaps she might like to work for me." Mark looked at me, and for a brief moment, I saw hope in his eyes. Hope that perhaps his mother was turning a new leaf. But I knew better. "Why are you offering this?" I questioned cautiously, keeping my gaze fixed on Nancy. "Family helps family," she answered, the words almost sounding believable as she smiled across the dinner table. Mark chimed in. "Mom, that's really generous of you. Are you sure about this?" Nancy leaned back in her chair, studying me as though I were a specimen under a microscope. Absolutely, Mark. I think Lena would be an asset to the company. I weighed my options. Unemployment wasn't a luxury I could afford, especially now that I had lost my steady income. I looked at Mark, whose eyes pleaded with me to accept. The opportunity, fraught with tension as it was, could be a lifeline. "All right," I finally said. "I'll take the job." Nancy's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Excellent. You start Monday." As Mark and I drove home, he took my hand. "See, maybe things are changing. Maybe Mom is finally coming around." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But as we drove away from Nancy's house, the sinking feeling in my gut told me I had just signed up for more than a job. I had stepped into an intricate web, and Nancy was the spider at center, plotting her next move. Would I become her prey, or could I turn tables? Only time would tell. The atmosphere at Nancy's company was what one would expect in a business empire built by a woman of her disposition. Controlled, calculated, and cold. Mark seemed to be the only person there who could flash a genuine smile, as though his humanity had survived the corporate machine his mother had engineered. I wondered how long my own humanity would last. From day one, the job was grueling. Projects landed on my desk faster than I could handle them. My colleagues were professional but distant, perhaps wary of the boss's daughter. In-law, unsure if I was an ally or a spy planted by Nancy. And then there was Nancy herself, who stopped by my cubicle occasionally, ostensibly to check on my progress, but more likely to scrutinize every mistake I could potentially make. "So how are you finding the work, Lena?" she'd ask, a hint of irony in her voice as though she already knew the answer. "It's challenging, but I'm managing," I'd reply, forcing a smile. "Good," she'd say, circling my desk like a shark. "We only want the best here." But the breaking point came sooner than expected. One fateful Thursday, Nancy summoned me to her office and handed me a folder thicker than a dictionary. "This is the Peterson account," she announced, her eyes locking onto mine. "I expect the report on my desk by tomorrow morning." "That's impossible," I blurted out before I could stop myself. This would take at least a week to go through. Nancy leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "Then I suggest you get started." It was a sleepless night spent in the office. When I finally arrived home, it was past midnight. Mark was sitting on the couch, worry lines creasing his forehead. "You okay, babe?" he asked, standing up as I entered. "Yeah, just a tough day at work," I mumbled, my voice tinged with exhaustion. "What happened?" Mark inquired, his eyes searching mine. "Your mom happened," I said, setting my purse down. "She's given me an impossible task." Mark sighed, his expression a mix of sympathy and frustration. "I'll talk to her. Make her understand that you shouldn't be overworked like this." "Don't," I said, lifting my hand to stop him. "I need to handle this myself." The next morning, after surviving on coffee and sheer will, I placed the completed report on Nancy's desk. She skimmed through it, her eyes emotionless. "Not bad," she said finally, "but come with me. I have something else to discuss." Thinking this was yet another assignment, I followed her as she led me down a corridor away from the main office area to a small room at the far end of the building. The door clicked shut behind us, and for the first time, I saw Nancy's face change. Her usual icy expression melted into one of open disdain. "I've tolerated you long enough," she snarled, each word like a slap to my face. "Divorce Mark and give me the house, or I'll make your life a living hell." In that moment, I realized that the job, the late-night assignment, the relentless scrutiny, these were all part of Nancy's scheme to break me, to drive a wedge between Mark and me, and claim what she felt was rightfully hers. I was standing at the edge of a precipice, my next decision critical. But as I looked into Nancy's cold eyes, I realized she had just underestimated me. She thought she had cornered a weak, vulnerable woman, but in that room, at that moment, she had no idea that the tables were about to turn. And for the first time since I'd met her, I smiled at Nancy, not out of politeness or deference, but because I knew that this was her undoing. She had just handed me the ammunition I needed to fight back. Even as Nancy's words echoed in my ears, my mind was already racing ahead, devising a plan. I had always suspected that working under her would be treacherous, so I had come prepared. My smartphone, discreetly placed in my pocket, had been recording the entire conversation. "Oh, is that so?" I replied, feigning defeat. "I guess I don't have much of a choice, do I?" You really don't, she sneered, clearly relishing what she believed was my surrender. I could see her eyes glint with a cruel satisfaction as she locked me in the small room. Stay here and think over your life choices, she said, as she walked out and turned the key in the lock, leaving me in isolation. As soon as she was out of earshot, I retrieved my phone from my pocket. Shaking but focused, I stopped the recording and immediately sent it to my personal email and cloud storage for redundancy. Then I dialed the office's internal security line. "This is Lena," I said calmly when the operator picked up. "I've been locked in a room at the end of the East Corridor by Mrs. Nancy. Could you please send someone to let me out?" Minutes later, the door clicked open and a security guard stood there, puzzled but compliant. "Are you all right, Mrs. Lena?" "I will be," I said, stepping out of the room, my eyes meeting his. "Thank you." When I returned to my desk, there was an unread message from Mark on my phone. "How's your day going?" "Not great," I texted back. "We need to talk tonight." "Okay, love you," he replied. I couldn't bring myself to type those words back, not when I was about to dismantle the world as he knew it. That evening, when Mark came home, he could sense the storm cloud hanging over our home. "Lena, what's going on? You seem upset." "Sit down, Mark," I said, gesturing to the couch. "We need to talk about your mother." His face hardened. What did she do now? I looked him in the eye, my heart pounding as I prepared to drop the bomb. "Mark, I've been recording all my interactions with your mother. Today she locked me in a room and told me to divorce you and give her our house, threatening to ruin my life if I didn't comply." I showed him the recording, and as he listened, I saw his face go through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, shame. "I had no idea she could go this far," he murmured, his voice tinged with regret. "I did," I said, setting my phone down. "That's why I was prepared." "So, what do we do now?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine. "We take this to the police," I said, my voice unwavering, "and we make sure she never interferes in our lives again." Mark nodded, steeling himself for the inevitable family implosion. "Okay, let's do it." The next morning, we found ourselves in the cold, sterile environment of the police station, the recording now in the hands of law enforcement. Legal wheels began to turn, and the battlefield was set for the final confrontation with Nancy. Little did she know, her empire was about to crumble, and for the first time, she was not in control. As Mark and I left the station, he took my hand. "You okay?" "I will be," I said, "when this is over." As we drove back home, I couldn't help but think of the house that had been the source of so much envy and strife. Soon, it would just be a home again, a sanctuary far removed from corporate warfare and family betrayals. And as for Nancy, her empire would soon have a new leader, one who truly understood the meaning of family. Legal proceedings have a way of turning life into a ticking clock, each second a step closer to a judgment that could either validate or destroy years of hard work and sacrifice. It's like walking on a tightrope with no safety net below. You can't afford a misstep. The case moved swiftly, between the damning audio evidence and corroborating accounts from other employees who had witnessed Nancy's bullying tactics. Though never to the extreme I'd experienced, the legal odds were stacked against her. But the real challenge was the impending family rupture. Mark was deeply conflicted, torn between loyalty to his mother and his commitment to me. We had always known that his mother was a volatile element in our relationship, but the reality of potentially seeing her behind bars was something neither of us had ever seriously considered. "Mark, how are you holding up?" I asked one evening as we sat in the living room, both of us lost in our thoughts. "I'm trying to reconcile with the fact that the woman who raised me could do something like this," he replied, his eyes clouded with a mixture of sorrow and anger. "Do you regret going through with this?" I asked, bracing myself for his answer. "No," he said firmly, looking me in the eye. "What she did is unforgivable. She needs to face the consequences." Finally, the day of reckoning came. The courtroom was filled with a palpable tension, family and employees sitting on either side, like two armies facing off before a battle. Nancy was already seated when we walked in, and her eyes met mine with a glare so icy it could have frozen time. "Mrs. Lena," the prosecutor began, "could you please explain the events leading up to your mother-in-law's actions?" As I unfolded the tale, recounting Nancy's attempts to overwork and undermine me, and finally her audacious act of locking me up and issuing her ultimatum, I saw the jury's faces turn from neutral to incredulous. When the prosecutor played the audio recording, Nancy's face tightened. It was the look of someone watching their empire crumble in real time. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Judge finally turned to Nancy. What can I say? She trapped me, Nancy spat out, realizing her options were limited. That's an admission of guilt, the prosecutor interjected. The defendant will refrain from speaking out of turn, the judge warned Nancy before turning to the jury. I believe we've heard enough. Jury, you may deliberate. It didn't take long. The jury returned, and the foreperson announced, we find the defendant guilty of blackmail and abuse of power. The gavel came down like the final nail in the coffin of Nancy's reign. Sentenced to 5 years in prison, the judge declared. As Nancy was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned to me one last time, her eyes no longer cold but aflame with a venomous fire. This isn't over, she hissed. But it is for you, I replied, finally letting out the breath I'd been holding. Mark squeezed my hand, a small, sad smile on his face. You okay? I am now, I said, knowing that the fight was finally over. Nancy's tyranny had come to an end, and our life could resume its course, free from the shadow of her malevolence. As we left the courtroom, stepping out into the sunlight, it felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel. Mark would inherit control of the company, and he already had plans to reform its toxic culture. And as for me, I was just looking forward to a quiet evening in our little house. The house that had become a home, a fortress, and finally, a monument to the victory of right over might. Life has a way of surprising you, just when you think you've got it all figured out. Nancy was in prison, and though that chapter was closed, its repercussions rippled through our lives like aftershocks following an earthquake. In the immediate aftermath, Mark took over the company, a $25 million business now in the hands of someone committed to sweeping changes. It's not going to be easy, cleaning up this mess, Mark mused as he looked through company files one evening. Our dining table now a makeshift workspace. I know, but if anyone can do it, it's you, I assured him, bringing over a cup of coffee. We'll see, he sighed, setting aside the papers and taking a sip. Hope is a good place to start, I said, joining him at the table. As Mark began restructuring the company, prioritizing employee well-being over profit margins, the initial pushback was intense. But soon, the atmosphere began to change. People seemed happier, more productive. Profits didn't soar, but they remained steady, proving that ethical business wasn't an oxymoron. About a year later, we received a letter. It was from Nancy, postmarked from prison. Do you want to read it? Mark asked, holding the unopened envelope in his hand. I'm not sure, I hesitated, a cocktail of emotions swirling inside me. Do you? He paused for a moment, then shook his head. So into the shredder it went, a symbolic end to a chapter neither of us wished to revisit. Despite everything, life found a way to move forward. Mark's business was thriving, not just in profits, but in the kind of workplace culture he had always envisioned. I found a new job, one that brought me genuine happiness and lacked the corporate Machiavellianism that had soured my previous experience. Yet, as we sat in our little house one quiet evening, a sense of profound relief washed over me. This home had been the catalyst for so much chaos, but had also stood unflinching as our sanctuary, our constant in a world of variables. Have you ever thought about selling this place? Mark asked out of the blue, his eyes scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time. And give someone else the chance to be tormented by a mother-in-law? No thanks, I joked. He chuckled, wrapping an arm around me. Fair point. As much as this house has been a source of contention, it's also been our refuge, I mused. I think we've earned the right to make new memories here, don't you? I couldn't agree more, Mark said, pulling me closer. Life would never be the same, but maybe that was a good thing. The ordeal had tested our limits, questioned our values, and forced us to confront uncomfortable truths. But here we were, not just surviving but thriving, building something new on the ruins of the old. As for Nancy, she was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of what happens when ambition blinds you to the value of love and family. Her empire had crumbled, and in its place stood something far more resilient, a home.